right, if you made it this far, that means you must be an expert at level 16, okay? But if you haven't mastered all the techniques and concepts in level 16, then you should turn back now, because you will only set yourself up for more frustration if you're not physically ready to approach these next few things here. Okay, so we're gonna be starting with these octave double vertical strokes. Okay, so I tell my kids all the time, when we have an octave, it doesn't matter actually how wide the interval is if you're playing a double vertical stroke. So all double vertical strokes, if you remember from level 15, are a wrist-based stroke. So we're still gonna be using our wrist regardless of how wide the interval is. Okay, so you will be tempted when you're holding a larger interval to start doing something with your elbow or other joints in your body, but it needs to come from just the wrist. Okay, so it'll look something like this. Right, so I'm still using a wrist stroke with a very wide interval here. Okay, so again, index finger needs to be ready to control and push that mallet out. Thumb is still relaxed, stays on top, all right? As we are holding this octave, we don't want to do something like this where your thumb is now just not on the mallet at all, because that just means you're gripping this inside mallet with your index and your thumb, and it creates so much tension, and it makes it a lot harder to get back into a small interval, right, which we will have to do later on in this level, okay? So even though we're not changing intervals, we still want to make sure that we're able to, and we're not building any bad habits by putting our fingers where they don't need to go around the mallet. So thumb's on top, index finger is still underneath, okay? Still a relatively relaxed grip, all right? And as you're holding this octave, you know, the mallets are now further apart, so just make sure that we're still able to look and see where you're striking. We shouldn't be doing something like this or hitting weird spots on the keyboard just because our mallets are not next to each other, okay? So again, wrist-based stroke regardless of the interval. All right, relax fingers. It's still a double vertical stroke, okay? Now to make this a little bit easier, definitely go slower at first. You are gonna have some trouble controlling these eighth notes at the written tempo, okay? So play some quarter notes. And really work on that mechanical motion, right, of this double vertical stroke in this larger interval. Okay, and as you move through the actual exercise and play it as written, you'll notice that we get into this 16th note measure on the fourth measure here of this line, right? So this is actually starting to develop our single stroke roll in double verticals. Okay, so it'll sound something like this, which is a skill that we will need for some of the more advanced literature that you will start to encounter. Not necessarily in octaves all the time, it'll be in different intervals, of course, but when we have a 4 mallet roll, that is typically how we would approach a roll with all 4 mallets. Okay, so as you move through the next few lines, we start to change positions a little bit. All right, so this first new motion here is what I call the elbow out motion. And we're going to be going from a fifth on F and C, right? I'm going into our F and B flat. Okay, when we do this, right, we are actually no longer aiming for the center of the bar, because that would actually be a very wide interval, and you would have to kick your elbow out quite far, and it would look something like this, which is not always ideal. So instead, we're going to be aiming for the edge of the bar, okay? And when I say edge, I really mean the edge of the bar, so where this corner is. So this is not the edge of the bar. This would be a bad beating spot, of course, because it's right on top of the node, right? And actually neither would this. This is still not the edge of the bar. The edge of the bar is right here. You'll notice that it sounds pretty different than there, okay? So I like to tell my students that when you're aiming for the edge of the bar, imagine you're trying to slice this mallet core in half, right? If this edge was a sharp edge, you would aim for the edge right in the middle of your mallet so that we're hitting in the correct spot right there. Okay, so when we're doing line number 2 and 3, as you're kicking your elbow out, think about where you're aiming, okay? And you don't actually need to go out all that far. We need to go out just a little bit, right? We still want to make sure that our hand is relatively neutral in its position, so we're not doing anything crazy with our hand, okay? Still staying relaxed. And as far as the intervals, there is a slight change when you go from the F and C to the F and B flat, but it's not as big as you may think it is, right? It's just a very slightly smaller interval change. Okay, so here's a little bit of line 2, so you can see it in action. And you may notice that I'm rotating my torso just a little bit, right? So I'm not staying completely facing forward when I'm doing something like this, right? My feet are actually in a kind of split stance here, so I'm standing like this, where my right foot is just a little bit more forward, right? And I'm just kind of leaning on that leg as I move over to the F and B flat. And then back to neutral, normal position when I'm hitting the F and C, okay? The opposite would be true when you're using your left hand. We're now using the other side, all right? But it's the same concept. You want to think about the edge of this B flat, and this is also going to be a very similar interval size to your A and F. So that's going from a 6th to a 5th. Because we're turning, we don't actually have to change intervals all that much. Okay, so here's line number 3. That was just the first 2 measures. Let's play those twice. All right, so again, we're thinking about moving the elbow out, not too far, and shifting your weight to your left foot to make that change easier. The next few lines all deal with larger interval changes, and this is where, if you haven't worked on moving your intervals quickly on the rebound of your previous stroke, this will get you into some trouble. Because now we're jumping from 3rds into 6th, and later from 5ths into octaves, which are all very large jumps, okay? So on these quarter notes here, make sure that we're moving right away, because you have to cover a lot more distance than you've had before. So here's line number 4. Okay, so again, on the rebound, you're changing intervals, right, into either smaller or bigger. All right, and then line number 5, we get to this octave from this 5th. This is where, and also from an elbow out position into the octave as well. So quite a few different positions that we'll need to find ourselves maneuvering. Okay, so here's line number 5. Okay, so that was just line measures. That was the first measure and the third measure. But of course, you would play it as written, right, or you would repeat it. But notice that you have to really think about where you're going next, okay? So as you're moving to this octave, right, notice also that I'm moving my hand slightly to the right. So it's not just an interval change where I open up my mallets, right? Because if you remember, interval changing happens in the inside mallet always. We don't really move the outside mallet really, okay? But it opens here, right? So if I were just to simply open that interval, I'm getting wider this way, but the note that I need to hit is actually up here. So you have to simultaneously open up your interval wider while you're shifting your hand to the right so that you're hitting the right notes, right, over the correct octave, right? So here's a 5th again with the octave. Okay, see how that works? And then same thing for this when we're going to our F and B flat, our 4th. All right, so in addition to moving our elbow back in, we're moving our hand to the side just a little bit so we can reach that same octave. Okay, and then the same is true, of course, with the left hand. All right. Now, if you are having difficulty, just like in level 16 with the larger intervals down here, feel free to also play this one an octave higher so that you're working on the same skill set, but it's not the extreme intervals of the lower part of the marimba. Of course, also take this slower. Right? Now there is a quarter note space built in to all of these interval changes, but if you need more time, that is totally okay. So say if you wanted to put a half note in there, right? That'll just give you some more time to change intervals, but you still want to make sure that you're doing it immediately on that upstroke, on that rebound, right? So you're not waiting, right? It's happening. Right, so you're already there well before you need to be. So we're still working on the same skill set. You're just giving yourself more time to think about what you need to be doing in between each note. Okay. When we get to lines 7, 8, and 9, these are not necessarily new skills, but we are adding a shift to our existing skill set. So the single independence, we're going from the lower manual here into the upper manual, right? So something to think about though, as we're doing that, because there is a shift, we're gonna have to be moving our hands and shifting our body weight just a little bit to get over the correct notes, okay? And what you'll notice also is that the hands are gonna be moving at different times, right? So what we don't want is, so I will play you line number 7, and this is what I don't want you to do, okay? Right? So you see how I moved my hands together, right? You don't actually have to do that, and it's also not efficient because by the time we have to move, your left hand should already be playing, right? So instead, we're gonna move our left hand into the upper manual as soon as it's available. So once it finishes its last note, it's gonna shift right away, and just wait there while the right hand finishes, and then we'll move the right hand. So this is what I would want you to do, okay? So take a listen, take a look. Right? So that way we're more efficient with our motions and our hands don't have any wasted time hovering over notes that they're not gonna immediately strike. When we go on to the single alternatings, this is a one-handed exercise, so this makes it easier to focus on just moving your weight back and forth and shifting as well. Right, and just like when we're doing double verticals and going up and down to the upper and lower manual, right? Thinking about having your stance be split a little bit, you're shifting your weight behind and keeping your upper arms not moving back and forth as much as you may want, and we're just keeping everything in one place and moving our entire body so that we're moving, so that the mallets are over the correct notes. The last thing on this level, 17 here, is our double lateral strokes. So this is a new stroke type, which is actually quite challenging for everyone to learn, right? Because this builds off of several different techniques that we've learned so far, okay? So it does stem from our double vertical stroke, okay? So you'll notice that we're gonna have a check pattern here of just double verticals, okay? And then it's gonna be what looks like a very quick single alternating, okay? But there's a really important difference between a lateral stroke and a single alternating stroke, right? Whereas single alternating is 2 separate motions, each with their own rebound. A double lateral should be treated as one motion with one rebound. So when we're playing a double lateral stroke, okay, and I'm gonna break it down completely for you, but here's what it would look like in normal speed, okay? But what's actually happening though is we're doing one motion with two different notes, two different strikes, and then we're pulling both of them back up. So if I were to slow down the motion, this is what we would see, okay? So we're starting from a double vertical height, okay? The outside mallet or the inside mallet, depending on which double lateral you're working on. In this case, we're working on our 4-3, so the out-in double lateral. The mallet 4 will strike first, while the mallet 3 stays up, then mallet 3 comes down, and then they both lift. And again, that was very, very slow, okay? Right, so there's basically 3 different points. We have point 1, point 2, and then the third point is when we're back up into our double vertical. If it's a little faster, it'll sound like this. Okay, and then once you actually put it into the correct tempo, right? So this is really important that you slow this down a lot to really understand the mechanics behind this motion, because this is something that is very, very challenging, especially if this is your first time approaching a double lateral stroke. Okay, my students, we spend hours working on this very, very slowly, with the metronome, of course, and just making sure that we understand the different steps to a double lateral. Okay, I also like to equate it to when we play double strokes in snare drum, right? Sometimes these are referred to as marimba diddles, because that's essentially what it is. You're playing 2 notes with 1 motion. Okay, so the actual exercise, we have this check pattern built in just to make sure that we're still thinking of it relating back to a double vertical, because that's where this stroke stems from. That's the foundation, right? So it sounds something like this. So one of the most important things while you're doing this, especially as you go faster, is to stay relaxed. Adding any tension in either of the mallets in your hand will make the rhythm and the lateral not behave the way you want it to, right? It'll just cause it to get kind of crushed down, and you won't be able to control the rhythm as well, right? And just while we are playing 2 different notes, right, we still want to make sure that the notes happen at the correct time. It's not simply just this kind of flam sound or flam motion. These are controlled rhythms that have to happen exactly when we want them to, not just because we're squeezing, right? And the same thing applies when we're playing double strokes or fast diddles. If you squeeze too much, the diddles are not going to be evenly spaced, and it won't sound like a smooth roll, okay? And we're not necessarily doing a roll here, but we still want to create and play correct rhythms, okay? So make sure you're staying relaxed. Do not squeeze, right? And really spend a lot of time working on all 3 points of contact here, okay? And of course, this is not necessarily in level 17, but beginning to reverse the lateral and working on the insides, right, will also be helpful to help develop strength so that your hand understands the motion both directions. So as you're working through level 17, you might start to realize that we're getting other body parts involved in our marimba playing. It's not just about the hands and the wrist, while those are very important, of course, because that's how we create our sound. It's also about how you use your feet, how you use your legs, how you use your arms and your elbows to move around the instrument, whether you're doing an elbow out situation, whether you're shifting back and forth. When you're shifting, right, we're starting to incorporate all of these different skills while keeping all of this, whether we're rotating, using a double vertical stroke, or even working on our laterals now, we're keeping all of that the same so that we're able to move around the instrument in a really fluid manner, right? And if you notice, I mean, hopefully you've noticed how big the marimba is. You're never just gonna be staying planted in one spot and trying to do and hit all the notes. It's just not gonna happen. You have to have the freedom and ability to move around the instrument and flow in a way that allows you to get you to where you need to be to hit the notes that you need to hit, right? So I would suggest looking up some prominent marimba artists on YouTube or online, and just watch how they navigate the instrument, how they move up and down, how they go back and forth, how they move their arms, while still maintaining correct technique with their wrists, with their fingers, with whatever kind of strokes that they're playing at the time. Right? All of that is still very good while they're moving around the instrument. So just like all the other levels that we've done so far, take everything very slow. Don't rush through any of it. Don't just jump into the play along track, right? That'll just create more frustration. Start at a slower pace and just build yourself up to that spot. All right, and make modifications as necessary. Like feel free to change the rhythm, make them easier. And you don't always have to be by a keyboard to work on some of these things. You can get creative with the way you practice. You can play on a table, right? You can play on your bed even, right? And just working on some of these different motions don't necessarily require keys to strike. You can still work on the motions of the wrist strokes and rotations on a variety of different surfaces. So just get creative, right? Don't feel the need to be in front of a marimba all the time when you practice some of these concepts. In fact, sometimes you can get a little crazy doing that, right? Find a different environment if you find that you're not making good progress, right? Just it can change how you approach what you're doing. So you're not just locked in the practice room.